just because it's the new year and so many of us are making New Year's resolutions to eat a little less of this, a little more of that. We don't have to eliminate what we love from our diets. Take me, for example. Gluten has been my preferred ingredient in food since I can remember. I'm one to eat bread for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and every snack in between. However, after a year following my discovery of gluten intolerance, I'm learning I can still eat my favorite foods. In fact, I made homemade yeasted gluten-free cinnamon rolls for Christmas this year that made me so happy. We can all still eat what we want. We just have to do it a little more carefully. Welcome to Summer Bakes the World. On this channel, we bake breads and dishes from all over the world, providing some history and lots of tips. Join me in discovering all the world has to offer. You know, you just might learn something new. The idea of eating more carefully brings us to today's bake. Even if you've decided to cut back on carbs or whatever this January, that doesn't mean you can't eat a good, wholesome, nutritious bake. Not only that, but with today's bake, we are learning about natural ingredients, the importance of the process of baking, and get an awesome story out of it. Today is all about the traditional Borodinsky dark brown Russian sourdough rye bread. Ooh, that was a mouthful. While there are many recipes for Russian rye bread, I was very careful and did a plethora of research to select one that was authentic to Russian culture. Simple in its ingredients, and one that requires a little work, like in the olden days. First up is the legend of this bread. Granted, there's no proven truth to the origins of the bread, but of the three common legends, this one is my fave. The Borodinsky Russian Rye Bread acquired its name from the bloodiest battle during the Napoleonic Wars at the Battle of Borodino of 1812 in Russia, located just west of Moscow. There was a widow whose husband died during the battle. She was so grief-stricken that she established a church on the same battlefield where she spent the remainder of her life. The nuns of the church created this recipe for mourning due to its solemn, dark color. It was fragrant, tasty, stayed fresh for a long time, and provided plenty of energy. That bread later became known as Borodinsky or Borodino after the battle. Rye is the most common grain in Russia, as rye is more of a frost-hardy grain than wheat. It can withstand the harsh winter temperatures and weather that wheat cannot. Thus, rye bread is the most common bread eaten with meals in Russia. Rye was much cheaper to grow than wheat, so most people made rye bread instead of any other. The Borodinsky bread is very simple in that wholemeal rye flour is the only flour, water is the only liquid, the combination of both creates the naturally occurring yeast, molasses and malt syrup are the only sweeteners, and coriander and salt are the only flavorings. Now, that's what I call a nutritious bread full of fiber, B vitamins, and one that contains fewer calories than a traditional wheat bread. Now that we have an appreciation for this bread, let's give it a go. Since this bread is very simple and mostly natural, it takes several days to make because we have to prepare the yeast, which is a sourdough created only of dark rye flour and water. Therefore, yeast does not exist in this recipe, only the naturally occurring one, the sourdough. Here are all of the ingredients: dark rye flour, water, salt, molasses, malt syrup or extract, they're the same thing, and coriander. Our first step is to make the sourdough. This is day one of the bread baking process, and it will take 6 days from start to eating. So you must plan ahead, but each step is very simple. Each step only takes a couple of minutes. The recipe I selected uses the metric system, but I have weighed and measured out everything into cups and spoons to guide the American way. So, see my adaptation of this recipe below this video in the description. Here's how you do it. For the starter, we're going to mix 45 grams of wholemeal rye flour, which is about 1/3 of a cup plus 1 tablespoon of dark rye flour, lightly spooned. To that, we're gonna whisk in 90 milliliters of lukewarm water, which equals 1/3 cup plus 1.5 tablespoons. We're just going to whisk this well into a nice smooth paste. Notice it's a thick mixture. It's just rye flour and water. We're gonna cover this mixture with plastic wrap. We're gonna leave it to ferment in a warm place for 2 days. It should start to bubble and develop a sweet appley smell. In 2 days, we will add our first feed. We are on day 3 now, 48 hours after making the starter. So now we get to take a look and provide its first feeding. The starter looks very similar to the way it did when we mixed it all together for that first time. It does have that appley smell to it. All we're gonna do now is add 30 grams of wholemeal rye flour. This is just dark rye flour, and this is equivalent to 1/4 cup. And then we're going to stir that with 60 milliliters of lukewarm water, which is the same as 1/4 cup. And then we're gonna do the exact same thing we did when we started this process, which is to cover with plastic wrap and let it sit overnight. Our first feed is complete, so now let's just cover it back up. We're gonna set it aside until tomorrow. We are now on day 4. About 12 hours or so after the first feeding last night. It's now time for the second feeding. Let's lift off the plastic. You can tell we have our water and flour mixture has just been sitting nicely. And to this, we're gonna add more flour and more water. So we're gonna add 340 grams of dark rye flour. And according to my scale, 340 grams is about 2 3/4 cup plus 1 tablespoon. And then to this, we're gonna just stir in 570 milliliters of lukewarm water. And according to my scale, that's a little bit less than 2.5 cups of water. And then we're just gonna stir this all together. And this is the last mixing we're going to do to allow our sourdough starter to finish the process. Okay, so now we have a nice, thick, smooth batter. We're gonna cover it back up with plastic wrap, set it aside for another 24 hours, allowing it to ferment. And then our sourdough should be ready to make our bread. We are on day 5. Our sourdough is ready. It's time to make the bread. Take a look at this starter. It has blossomed all the way up to the top of the bowl and the bottom of the plastic wrap. So this is our sourdough, our yeast, and it has definitely grown. It's ready to be used and it should produce a great bread, but we'll see. So let's remove this plastic. I didn't spray my plastic like I normally did because I honestly didn't think it was gonna rise this much. But we can scrape all that goodness off. Look how jiggly it is. Ooh, I can definitely smell. It's fermented, but it has that appley smell that I was telling you about. This looks like an awesome starter. We should have a good bread. Okay, I wanna show you another thing. So notice we did talk about how jiggly it is, but when I put my spoon in there, all the bubbles just are popping from the center. So we know this is alive and working as it should. Oh, you can even hear as those bubbles are popping within the mixture. So we're gonna be making 2 loaves out of this. We will likely not use all of this mixture, but we will use most of it. So the rest of it you just put in the refrigerator and continue to feed it, or use it all in another bread and you don't have any left over. Or give it away as a present. You're gonna need a really large bowl. So to that, we're gonna add 800 grams of starter. Now I put my 800 grams measured, it's 4 cups. So we're gonna mix all of our ingredients together. I'm gonna start with the wet ones. So 4 cups of starter. To the starter, we're gonna add 290 milliliters of lukewarm water, and that's about 1.25 cups. Stir that in a little bit. So next we're going to add our molasses, and this molasses is 60 grams. It's just a tiny bit less than 1/4 cup, but over 1/4 cup will be fine. I sprayed my 1/4 cup with cooking spray before I put my molasses in it. Notice it comes pretty much completely out. Not much effort to get every little last drop out of this. And then the other wet ingredient we're gonna add is, now this is malt syrup, malt extract, it's the same. It's 30 grams, which is about a heaping tablespoon. If you've never used malt extract before, think of it as a good sweetener substitute for any kind of a sweetener, sugar, molasses, honey, in baked goods like breads. For this, recipe, you only need a tiny bit of this malt syrup, but if you buy it, then use it in your breads as your sugar substitute. And I haven't done it yet, it's my plan, but my understanding is that it makes the best pizza crust. You just sub it for equal amounts of the sweetener. It'll not only add the sweetness to your pizza crust, but it will also darken it a little bit more, so you get that pizza parlor style looking crust. So we're finished with our wet ingredients. Let's add our flour. So this is 100% dark rye flour. There's no wheat in this. This is like 100% rye bread. This is 680 grams of rye flour, which equals out to 5 cups plus 2 tablespoons. To this wet mixture that we're adding the flour, we're gonna add 15 grams of salt, which is 2 teaspoons. And then our last ingredient, which happens to be a spice, which gives it that signature Borodinsky bread flavor, is going to be 1 teaspoon of coriander, and this is ground coriander. And then we're just going to stir all this up and stir it up really well. So you do want to take time to mix up all of your ingredients, and this is going to be a soft and sticky dough, and it will not be kneaded. This is like the super easiest peasy bread that you can make. No kneading, and you still get to use that homemade sourdough. All right, I've been mixing for a few minutes, and this is about the consistency that we want it. Take a look, it's very sticky, but we're not gonna knead it, we're not even gonna touch it, hardly. So we're gonna place the dough in 2 loaf pans. The directions call for loaf pans that are at least 900 grams each, or like 420 grams. Anyway, minus the metric system here, you just need 2 good sized loaf pans. Mine are each about 1.5 quart, 1.5 liters, which is plenty big enough for the dough we need here. Now, the directions say we can use our hands and scoop it in here, or you can use a spoon. Just make sure that your pans are sprayed well. And I'm just gonna try to eyeball mine. I'm not gonna measure anything here. And we're just gonna put the dough in and just make sure that I have one pan that's slightly bigger than the other, so I will probably put just a tad bit more dough in that one. Just make sure they're kind of up to equal size height in the pan. That's what I'm gonna go for. So you can use your hands or you can use your spoon. It's whatever you wanna do. To touch the bread, the easiest way to be able to touch this without it getting too sticky on your fingers is just wet your hands. That's what I like to do when I'm messing with wet dough. I've just dampened my hands with water so that I can form this a little bit better in the pan. Notice with wet hands, you have no sticking going on, just so I can get a nice shape so that we don't have any pieces breaking off and to get it fitted into the pans. All right, I think mine are pretty height-wise, they look about the same. Now all we want to do is cover these with sprayed plastic wrap, and the dough needs to rise to the top of the pan. So having said that, allow a little bit of space so your dough can rise without the plastic interfering with its rising. So just leave a little loose at the top, but make sure you close down the sides so there's no drafts get in, but yet it has space to rise. Here's where it's gonna be iffy as to how long it sits. Depending on how warm your environment is, this could take anywhere from 2 hours to 12 hours to rise. So I'm gonna sit, as usual, like I always do, sit my dough over on the stove. I have the oven warming to 200 degrees, so that will create that nice environment. I'm gonna sit these under the pilot light of my microwave, so that should create a little bit more heat. I'll check it 2 hours and we'll see what it looks like, and if it's risen to the tops of the pans, then we can put it in the oven. Right, let's sit it over the stove and let's see how long this takes. All right guys, we are 6.5 hours into our rise time. Remember I said to rise between 2 and 12 hours, even longer? Well, I've had mine over warm oven, and still we have a long way to go. So 6.5 hours in, and we are a little bit away from reaching the top of this pan for both of our rye bread. So it's like bedtime now. I'm going to leave this on the stove to rise overnight. So it's definitely gonna be longer than 12 hours by the time I put it in the oven, which will likely be okay given we're already 6.5 hours in and it hasn't risen a whole lot. I think we're gonna be okay overnight, even with the oven turned off. I think it's gonna be fine. But we'll see. But hey, that's what it's like when you have to bake. You just don't know what you're gonna run into, and then we modify and we adjust. So back over the stove for more rising. Well, now we are on day 6. We are near the end of the rising time, so we need to preheat the oven to 425 degrees. We're gonna uncover the loaves, sprinkle with a little bit of ground coriander, and then immediately place it in the oven for 15 minutes. Reduce the temperature to 350 degrees and bake for another 35 to 45 minutes. The bread will be dark, but if you're concerned, just add a piece of foil to the top as the bread is baking. So let's get the oven ready. Believe it or not, these two pans have been sitting over the stove for 20 hours, and they don't look much different than they did between the 3 and 4 hour mark yesterday. So my pans are bigger than the recommended pan size. I have about a 1.5 quart pan, and the recommended is a little over a quart. So I can't be surprised that my dough didn't rise up to the pans. So what I recommend, and I'm going to put this in the directions, is that you just let these rise between 2 and 6 hours, and that's probably enough. So I'm ready to put mine in the oven. As the recipe suggests, I'm just sprinkling a little bit of ground coriander on top. Some of the traditional recipes like to put the coriander seed on top. This recipe calls for coriander that's ground. Since this is a rye, it's a very heavy grain bread, so it should be done with internal temperatures between 205 and 210 degrees. Okay, both of my loaves are out of the oven. I actually cooked them at different times. I cooked this one first. This was the one that was originally the taller, bigger one. But you can see it's been sitting for about an hour out cooling, and it's already kind of condensed itself. It's no longer maintaining that rise that it had. Whereas the other one, I just pulled it out of the oven, and it's still a thick bread. I have a feeling it's going to sink a little bit too as it rests. Notice they have both cracked on top. So obviously it was rising in the oven. And you can also see the powder from the coriander that I sprinkled on before I put them in the oven. I'm going to take this one out of the pan and let it cool on this wire rack. Then once these both cool completely, you need to cover them well, wrap them in foil, plastic wrap, whatever, and let them sit for 24 hours so the flavors meld and the loaves have a chance to ripen, and then you can dig in. This bread keeps well at room temperature for up to a week as the flavor continues to deepen, and eat it as you choose. Take a look at our 2 cooled rye loaves here. Notice that they are very dense, pretty heavy. Let's break into one of these and quickly take a look and see what we have on the inside. Ooh, this is super hard to cut into. All right, notice all the holes from our sourdough starter. Let's give it a taste. We are now on day 6 or 7. I don't even know anymore. But this bread should take you 6 days. I went an extra, 12 hours longer in letting it rise, and it didn't really change much. So our lovely Borodinsky Russian sourdough rye bread has cooled. The flavors have had time to meld, and we just saw what it looks like. It's really dark because there's 100% rye flour in this bread, and it's very, very simple. So, since it does have gluten from the actual rye grain and malt syrup, I will not taste it, but Scott will be doing the honors today. So, welcome to Baking Russia Day, or week, I mean. If you would do the honors, if you go ahead and give it a taste, and then while you're doing that, I'll give a quick summary of what this bread is. So, the Borodinsky Russian Rye Bread is a simple, clean, naturally occurring yeast bread made with dark rye flour and water, which is the sourdough part. It has molasses and malt syrup for sweetness and coloring. And then there's no yeast in here at all, but there's coriander and salt to add a little bit of flavor. That's it. Very, very simple. I know you're not a huge fan of rye bread. I wish I could eat it because I do enjoy it. You knowing a little bit now about how it's made and why it's made, can you tell us first off, what are you tasting?
It's different than any other rye bread that I've had.
Why?
It's very dense and very heavy in rye flavoring. Are there any other types of flour in it?
No, and that's an interesting question because most rye breads have a good amount of whole wheat flour with the rye, which allows it to rise and hold that rise, and a lot of them have yeast. Everything in this bread is about as natural as we could go. 100% rye and 100% sourdough created from flour and water. So it is very, very simple.
It's also clearly there's no cane sugar in this.
Yes, and in fact the sugar that is in it, molasses and a little bit of malt syrup, very, very little.
That would make sense. It's not very sweet at all. It's definitely not a dessert bread.
Well, you're going to have to eat this. So how would you enjoy eating this bread? And I hate to say that because I don't mean to be negative about it, because it does have its place in a meal.
Well, where would its place be traditionally?
Good question. So in Russia, this rye bread is commonly eaten with borscht, which is a beet stew. So it's used to dunk, and it's used to sop up flavors from the juices in a soup. And funny you should ask that, because I've had borscht before. And just a quick little personal story. When I had it, it was prepared by a Polish woman who lived during World War II in Poland. Her family had to escape Poland, so she took her kids and came to the United States, and she brought with her her family recipes of borscht and pierogies, which I love to this day because of that wonderful woman. And she had some amazing stories about evacuating Poland during World War II. And this rye bread would be perfect with those types of soups and stews. I imagine it would be great dunked in a potato and leek soup as well. Oftentimes this kind of bread is eaten as a Reuben with pastrami and cheese, sauerkraut, coleslaw. And then my favorite is cream cheese mixed with fresh dill, capers, and topped with smoked salmon. So I know how I would eat this bread, but everyone has their own preferences of how they would prefer to eat it.
Since it's such a dense bread, would it be able to soak up much of the soups?
Not if it's a thick one. If you were to let it sit in maybe a thin soup, it would probably absorb some of the liquid. Okay. But in a thick one, I might use it more as cleaning up your bowl, or just dunk it and eat it so that you've got a nice cream stuck on the bread when you take a bite.
So use it like a sponge
that you eat. Exactly. Use it like a sponge. Well, I hope you gained a little appreciation for rye bread today and willing to try it as a healthy alternative to the traditional white or wheat bread. Thanks for watching. I really enjoy researching, preparing, and making these videos. I truly hope you enjoy watching them. So please share them with your family and friends. Remember to subscribe, like, or leave comments. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, da shleduye shvoraza, put on your aprons and go bake the world.